Welcome to another video from explainingcomputers.com. This time I'm going to share my top 7 tips and tweaks for Ubuntu. This remains one of the most popular Linux distros, but can still be a bit daunting for those transitioning from Windows. So let's go and see what I personally do in Ubuntu after a clean install. Right, here we are in Ubuntu, and specifically Ubuntu 24.04, which is the latest long-term support or LTS release with standard support until April 2029. However, everything I'm about to cover will work just fine in Ubuntu 22.04, which looks like this, or indeed in Ubuntu 25.10, which is the most recent interim release. And at the time of making this video, beta images for Ubuntu 26.04 to be released in April 2026 are also available, and currently all of my tips and tweaks will work there too. I'm not in this video going to cover how to install Ubuntu, as I detailed this in my Ubuntu 24.04 review. However, I would note that when prompted, I ticked Install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware, as well as download and install support for additional media formats, which is what I would strongly recommend. And I also opted for an extended selection install, which includes additional utilities and LibreOffice. And so, if we go down here bottom left and click where it says Show Apps like that, we can see the many applications pre-installed on the system presented across these 2 pages. And it's worth noting here that utilities is actually a folder. If we click it, we get to many utilities inside the folder, including, for example, the disk usage analyzer, which I like to open up after a clean install to check on free space available on the system. So, what else do I always do very rapidly after a clean install? Well, I always very rapidly go up to the right of the top bar and click and then open up here the System Settings menu like this, where I go across to the left-hand side, scroll down almost to the bottom and click on Accessibility. And then here I go to Seeing, open it up and click on Large Text like that. And then I also go down to Cursor Size and select normally the middle cursor like that. And I know not everybody needs to do this, but if you do, you'll want to do so quickly, and having larger text and a larger cursor will make things easier to see in this video. More broadly, there are also a lot more settings here, some of which we'll later return to. However, if you're working on a laptop, you may rapidly want to visit Mouse and Touchpad to make sure you've got scrolling and other things set up the way you like. Next, it's a good idea to check that everything is up to date and will continue to update as you desire. Ubuntu may present a message about this anyway, but if it doesn't, we can go to Applications, where there's 2 relevant programs, Software and Updates, and also the Software Updater. And guess what? To check for updates, we need to run the Software Updater, so we will, and we'll now speed on through. There we go, there are some updates to install, there usually are, so we'll click to Install Now. And there we are, it's finished and a restart is required. We don't always need one of those in Linux after updates, but we do here, so we'll click on Restart Now. And here we are back again. Now, with any updates installed, it's also a good idea to review your update settings. And this is where we use the other icon we saw a second ago. We go to Software and Updates like that. And if we look across to the third tab, it's called Updates and gives us a range of options. As we can see, Snap Package Updates, or in other words, updates for applications delivered via Ubuntu's Snap Packaging method, are checked routinely and installed automatically. And whether or not we agree with this, we don't have any choice. But for everything else, quite a lot of choice is available. As we can see, we're currently subscribed to all updates, but this could be just security and recommended updates or security update only. We can also choose how often updates are checked for, from daily all the way through to 2 weeks or indeed never. We can choose what happens when security updates are available. They can be downloaded and installed automatically, which would be my recommendation, but that can be changed as well. And for other updates, we can choose to have a requester asking if we want to install them displayed either weekly or immediately or every 2 weeks. And for me, the defaults in Ubuntu are pretty good, so I'm going to leave things on the defaults here, but it's worth noting that one of the reasons to run Ubuntu, to run Linux more generally, is because it leaves the user completely in control. And this is one of the most critical places where this control is exercised. Next, let's turn to the dock, which is the panel that by default appears on the left-hand side of the screen and which contains icons to access your favorite applications and also potentially mounted drives. So for example, I could click here to open the file manager from the icon there. There it is, very exciting. And if I plug in a USB drive, there we are, the drive has appeared on the dock. We can see it's a drive called Stanley. We can open it up, very exciting again. And if we want to eject that drive, we can go across to the drive, right click and perform an eject operation. Now, after a clean install, Ubuntu cannot know what your favorite applications are, and so you might want to make a few changes. And this is very easy. For example, if we don't want to have the Thunderbird email client on the dock, we simply go to it, right click, and we can unpin it like that, and it disappears. But maybe we want to add something else there. We can do that by going to Show Apps like that, picking an application, for example, maybe the calculator, right click here, pin to dash, and it appears, there we are, on the dash. If we want to reorganize things, we can do that too. Just go to an icon, click and hold and drag. We can have it, so for example, second on the list like that. It's all very easy to use. There are also a range of dock preferences, which we find by going up here top right and going back to the system settings menu we were in previously. And if we go all the way up and we go to Ubuntu desktop, I think I'll give us a bit more space here to see everything at the same time, just like that. There we are. You can see we can change the icon size on the dock. By default it is 48, but we can make it larger like that. I tend to do that. We can make it very small if we wanted to, but I think I'll leave it on the largest. There's also a setting to auto hide the dock. If I take this window at the moment and push it towards the dock, it just goes underneath. If I maximize the window, it will just go to the edges of the dock. But if we auto hide the dock like that, when a window goes near it, it'll move out of the way very politely. We can also change the position of a dock on the screen. It's currently left. It could be on the right. Doesn't feel right to me that. It could be at the bottom. It's hidden itself, hasn't it? Because the window is fairly big. There we are. It's come back. But I think I'll put it back on the left. Finally, we've got an option to configure dock behavior. And this gives us the option of whether or not we want to show volumes, to show storage devices on the dock. As you can see, we've got options for that. And we've also got options to turn on or turn off the trash. If I click on turn off the trash can disappears, or we can move it back if we wish. And so, as you can see, we've got a lot of dock control here in Ubuntu. Greetings. We're now going to turn on a firewall. This provides a barrier between your computing activities and the internet. And whilst there's probably already a firewall in your router to protect your network, it's also sensible to run one on every individual computer connected to it. And if your computer's a laptop, you may use it away from home. To this end, a firewall is included here in Ubuntu. However, it's not turned on by default. The reason is that nothing is installed in Ubuntu that will accept an unsafe external communication. However, if any malware gets onto your system, you could be at risk. Whilst Ubuntu has a firewall included, it doesn't have a graphical interface. We're therefore going to open up the App Center over here. Here it is, hello, and we're going to search for Firewall, which should list several apps, including the UFW or uncomplicated firewall that's already installed. However, what we're going to select here is Firewall Configuration, which is a graphical interface to the uncomplicated firewall, or the GUFW. So let's click on Install, after which we have to enter our password. And there we are, installation is complete. So let's close down the App Center and go to Show All Apps. we're probably now on the second screen. Yes, we can find firewall configuration, so let's open it up. And because we're about to make an important system change, we again have to enter our password. And here we have the firewall graphical interface, where to turn the firewall on, all we have to do is to take this status slider here and put it over there like that. And oh look, the little shield has changed color to indicate the firewall is now activated. As we can see, different profiles are available, and for home use, the default home profile should be fine. This allows all outgoing communications but denies incoming. This means that, for example, you'll be able to browse the web and use email, but all incoming requests for communication will be blocked. So this should, for example, prevent any botnet malware from accepting an external connection. Note that if you do need some externally instigated communications to get through, for example to allow remote access to your computer via SSH, then you can add rules for this if required. But for most home users, the standard home profile with no additional rules will be fine. Next, it's a good idea to check that a new Ubuntu install is using the right drivers. Drivers for most devices, including AMD and Intel GPUs, are contained in the Linux kernel, so should be automatically in use. And if, during install, you tick the box to install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware, then any proprietary drivers, such as those for an NVIDIA GPU, should also be installed. However, they may not yet be selected. To check, we'll return to Show Apps, where we can either select additional drivers, or we can go down once again to Software and Updates, which is what I'm going to do. And in fact, if we had selected additional drivers, it would just take us to this tab in Software and Updates. And the reason I've not gone there straight away is that it's a very good idea to make sure that under Ubuntu Software, the option is checked to allow the downloading of proprietary drivers for devices. And this should already be ticked if you opted for third-party software in the installer, as we just saw. But if the proprietary drivers checkbox is not ticked, tick it and confirm with your password if required. Next, we will now go across to additional drivers, where opening this up will force Ubuntu to check if any additional drivers are available. As we can see, on this computer there are quite a few additional drivers, but on many computers there will be none, and you will see a screen like this indicating that no additional drivers are available and that no proprietary drivers are in use. And if this is the case, you can congratulate yourself for checking that all is well and go and have a cup of tea. However, if additional drivers are available, for example for a Wi-Fi adapter, you'll be given the option to select them and to apply changes. Back here on our test system, an NVIDIA GPU is installed and many proprietary drivers, or in other words drivers provided by NVIDIA, are available. And here the recommended proprietary driver is already selected. However, this may not be the case, with your system instead using an open source driver that will offer reduced functionality. Or, in other words, your system could look like this, where it's telling us the device is using an alternative driver, which is the open source driver for NVIDIA cards, rather than one of the proprietary drivers from NVIDIA. And in this circumstance, it's a good idea to change to a proprietary NVIDIA driver, which should offer improved performance. And you might be asking me, which one do you pick? Well, almost always it's the one at the top. Here we can see this one says proprietary tested, the others don't say tested. You may have recommended by it, something like that, but almost always it's the top one on the list. And you should similarly choose the available proprietary drivers for things like Wi-Fi adapters if available. And then once you've selected the best drivers, you need to apply changes like that. And as usual in Linux, then enter your password. After which, as it says here on the screen, you need to restart your computer to complete the driver changes. Greetings! We're now going to install GNOME Tweaks, which is a great customization tool. So let's open the App Center over there and we'll search for GNOME, which is pronounced with a hard G because it's a double acronym. And down here we have GNOME Tweaks, so let's go to that and install, which will ask for our password. And there we are, it's now installed. So if we go to Show Apps, we may initially struggle to find GNOME Tweaks because it's classed as a utility, and so it's inside the Utilities folder. There it is, so let's now run it up, where we can see it provides a range of settings under 7 different categories, including appearance and Windows. And I'm not going to go through all the settings here, clearly it would take a long time, but for example here in Windows, I particularly like the setting to center new windows, which I always turn on. Meanwhile, in fonts over here, there's lots of useful things we can do, not least at the bottom of the screen, there's a scaling factor, which is now at 1.25 because we earlier selected large text, but we can alter this in 1% settings. So for example, if we want to do 1.34 if we wanted to, we could do that as a scaling factor. And also here under font, if we go back to the top, we can change the interface text, selecting both the font and its point size. This is significant because back in 2023, Ubuntu confused the term less readable with the term modern, and as a result implemented a thinner, less accessible interface font. But here in Tweaks, we can set something clearer, including the old font. However, we first need to install the old font, which I'll cover in the next part of the video. Just before we get there though, I'd note that whilst Tweaks is a great extension, there have been some reports that in appearance, if you change the cursor setting from anything other than its default of Yarrow, it can cause crashes or other problems. And whilst this is not something I've personally experienced, to be on the safe side, you may wish to leave alone the Tweaks cursor setting. Finally, we're going to install some fonts, and specifically the older, thicker Ubuntu interface font, as well as some standard Microsoft fonts you may well need. I've left this until last, as it's the one thing we need to do in the terminal. So let's show apps and launch the terminal. There it is. And in the terminal, I'm going to right click and go to Preferences and then Custom Font. And we'll increase the font size a little bit so we can see it a bit more easily on the screen. I think maybe that will be okay. Or that's so much better so we can see the commands in the video. So to install the old Ubuntu interface font, we're going to enter the command sudo apt-install fonts-ubuntu-classic, where sudo means we need to execute the command as a super user. Apt refers to the advanced package tool. Install means install, and the rest is what we're going to install. And as usual, we have to enter our password and press Y to confirm. Next, so that Ubuntu doesn't replace the old font with a new one in an update, we also need to execute this. There we are, and we can now go back to Tweaks. There it is, and up to Fonts and Interface Text, where what we want is Ubuntu Regular. There it is, although it'll appear on the screen just as Ubuntu. And watch what's going on over here. The magic's about to happen. We will select this like this. And there we are. We have a much thicker font, although it's slightly smaller, so we'll just do that again. And this time up the point size as well. Yes, I'm much happier with that. Although, as you might have noticed, things have gone a bit strange up here because we've changed the main interface font. So what we need to do now is a reboot. And here we are back again. Next, let's open up LibreOffice Writer over here, and I'm going to load in a recent document, which is this one. And this is a document I wrote in Microsoft Word on a Windows PC, where in Windows it looked like this. But if we come back to Ubuntu, it looks like this, slightly different, as some standard Microsoft fonts like Comic Sans and Verdana are not available. However, we can install a set of common Microsoft fonts for free, subject to an appropriate end-user agreement. To do this, we first need to go to Software and Updates, back in the things over here, and there's Software and Updates, like that, and we just need to check that we have got ticked the box for downloading software restricted by copyright or legal issues, and as I've noted many times, this should be the case if you chose such an option in the installer. So we can now go back to the terminal. There it is up here, and I've made it slightly too big, haven't I? Let's make it roughly that size, like that, where we now need to enter the command sudo apt install ttf-mscorefonts-installer. And again, Y to accept. Here it goes, and here is the MS Core Fonts installer. And this sometimes confuses people because they want to use the mouse to go and click down here to say OK. You can't do that. This is a command line application. That's why we have to run it in the terminal. And so what we need to do to accept the license is to use the Tab key, which takes us down to OK, and then we can press Enter, where we can now move across with the arrow key to Yes, and again press Enter. And there we are. Everything was done with no errors. And so we can go back to LibreOffice, very exciting indeed, go back to our document, and this time it looks right. We can see the correct rendering of Comic Sans MS, and have now got available in Ubuntu a range of standard Microsoft fonts. So there we are, my top 7 tips and tweaks for Ubuntu. Although I'm now thinking perhaps it should have been a top 8 list, because I'd also recommend going to the App Center, searching for Isle Riot, and installing this excellent Solitaire game. So it's available in case of emergencies. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.